What happens to us after we die? This may be the ultimate question in all of human existence. For a woman named Pam Reynolds, though, she claimed that she found the answer. During the 1980s, Pam Reynolds was a big deal in the music world. Not only was she a singer-songwriter, but she also owned a music company called Southern Tracks that worked with everyone from Bruce Springsteen to Pearl Jam. But Pam's favorite song she ever wrote was not one of her big hits. It was one that she wrote about the time that she died and came back to life. That's because Pam Reynolds had what many people say was the most well-documented near-death experience in history. One that occurred under close medical observation. And the things Pam said she saw while she was clinically dead on the operating table still leaves doctors baffled. Pam Reynolds' story began on a hot summer day in August of 1991. On that day, Pam and her husband were in Virginia Beach promoting a new record, when Pam became dizzy and disoriented. Then, she forgot how to talk. This meant she couldn't even verbalize to anyone exactly what was wrong. It's unclear exactly how long this episode lasted, but eventually Pam sought medical help. Doctors performed an MRI scan on her, and it revealed something even more terrifying. Pam had an aneurysm on her brainstem. This was the part of the brain that controlled many major life functions, including swallowing and breathing. In addition, this scan showed that this aneurysm was leaking, making it a ticking time bomb inside her skull that could either kill her or permanently incapacitate her at any moment. Pam's doctor in Atlanta sent her to a neurosurgeon named Dr. Robert Spetzler at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Arizona. Dr. Spetzler admitted to Pam that the aneurysm was located in such a difficult part of the brain that there was a high chance that she might die on the operating table. But he said that the best thing they could do to increase Pam's odds for survival was to perform a procedure called a cardiac standstill. This was a difficult procedure where they would lower Pam's body temperature down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, then drain all the blood from her body and stop her heart from beating. With no blood pumping through Pam's system, this would reduce the risk of the aneurysm rupturing before they could remove it. Then the doctors would restart her heart and get the blood flowing once again. Or in other words, Dr. Spetzler planned on killing Pam, then bringing her back to life. It was a risky procedure. Cardiac standstill operations had been performed since 1952. But even 40 years later, there remained a 12% mortality rate. But nonetheless, this still remained Pam's best shot at survival. On the morning of the operation, Pam was placed on a gurney and rolled into the operating room. Her arms and legs were secured to the operating table, her eyes were taped shut, and a breathing tube was inserted into her windpipe. They also placed molded speakers into her ears. These earbuds made clicking noises that were as loud as a jet plane taking off. This would allow the surgeons to monitor Pam's neural activity and let them know that it was safe to drain her blood. The anesthesiologist administered a large dose of barbiturates to ensure Pam was unconscious as they began the procedure. Then they watched as Pam's brainwaves on the monitors slowed, then completely flatlined. There was a 20-person medical team in the operating room who were there to make sure that not only were they able to stop Pam's heart, but also to ensure that they could bring her back. Pam's body was wrapped in cooling blankets to lower her body temperature. A long, thin catheter was inserted through her jugular vein and from there into her heart. The catheter was attached to a heart-lung machine. After Pam's body temperature reached 60 degrees Fahrenheit, Dr. Spetzler administered a heavy dose of potassium chloride, which stopped her heart. Thus, with no brain or heart function, Pam Reynolds was clinically dead. All the blood was drained out of Pam's head right before Dr. Spetzler began cutting into her skull. But strangely, despite being dead, Pam later said that she could hear the noise of the bone saw cutting into her skull. The singer-songwriter even described the sound as a perfect, natural D. As the sound continued, the more it felt like something was tugging at her. Suddenly, Pam said it was as if something inside her head popped. The next thing Pam knew, her soul flowed out of her body through the top of her head. She said she experienced a powerful sense of clarity as she rose up to the ceiling. From this position, she could see her own body laid out on the operating table with all the surgeons and other medical personnel working on her. They had shaved part of her head to perform the surgery. She was also able to count the number of people in the room with her. Pam recognized Dr. Spetzler. but everyone else was a stranger to her. She was able to see the variety of medical instruments they were using on her. This included a drill in Dr. Spetzler's hand that resembled an electric toothbrush. Then Pam heard a female cardiac surgeon remark how her arteries were too small inside her thigh. Pam was confused by this statement. Why did they need to work on her legs when her brain was the problem? Pam heard Dr. Spetzler tell the surgeon to try the other thigh. While all this was going on, Pam felt as if she was still being pulled upward. She was being pulled into a long, dark tunnel. As Pam hurtled up through this tunnel, she began to hear a familiar voice calling to her. It was that of her deceased grandmother. This is something that is commonly reported among people who have near-death experiences, or NDEs for short. People often report talking to deceased loved ones who comfort them along their journey. At the end of this long, dark tunnel, Pam could see a brilliant pinprick of light that rapidly grew larger and larger. The light grew so big and bright that she tried to shield her eyes, but her hands were insubstantial. They were barely there. She was just a formless consciousness being sucked up towards this light. As Pam got closer to the light, she began to see some familiar figures. There was her deceased grandmother, her great-great-aunt Maggie, and her Uncle Gene. Pam asked her relatives if the light was God. One of them told her that the light was God's breath. Pam felt comforted by all this. She wanted to stay in that light forever. But then her uncle told her it wasn't her time, and that she had to go back. Her uncle told her it would be just like diving into a swimming pool, only Pam didn't want to go. While she was talking to her uncle, she could see the doctors working the defibrillator down below, attempting to restart her heart. Pam pleaded with her uncle to please let her stay, but he just smiled at her and gave her a little shove. And suddenly, Pam felt herself shooting back down the tunnel toward her body. She said she could hear the Eagles song Hotel California playing inside the operating room as the doctors restarted her heart. Pam recalled hearing the line, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave," just as she began to regain consciousness. Now, there's a lot about this story that's strange, but one thing particular to note is that Pam still had those earbuds in her ears blasting that clicking sound, meaning that she shouldn't have been able to hear the song at all, yet somehow she knew exactly what song was playing. That wasn't the only thing Pam remembered either. Even still, at first, Pam thought she was just hallucinating, so she kept her experiences to herself for many months. She finally opened up to Dr. Spetzler during a follow-up visit a year later. She told her doctor everything that she remembered, right down to the number of people in the room with her. Dr. Spetzler was stunned, because everything Pam described about the operation was accurate. Pam not only knew the number of people in the room, she also knew about the drill that looked like an electric toothbrush. She knew about the surgeon who mentioned her tiny arteries. She knew all of it, right down to them playing Hotel California. But none of this should have been possible. Pam's ears were plugged, and her eyes were taped shut. Not to mention the fact that Pam was, by all medical definitions, dead. From a scientific perspective, none of this made any sense. Dr. Spetzler eventually put Pam in contact with a cardiologist named Dr. Michael Sabom, who had been researching near-death experiences. He went through Pam's medical records and was able to confirm practically every detail she described. This was by far the best documented near-death experience Dr. Sabom had ever heard of. But not everyone is so convinced by Pam Reynolds' experience, though. An Australian anesthesiologist named Dr. Gerald Worley studied Pam's case, and he says he can explain everything. He believes that when they cut into Pam's skull, she was jolted into consciousness. At that point, they had not yet drained all the blood from her brain. Worley also thinks Pam could still hear despite the clicking earplugs, either because the earplugs weren't fitting tightly enough, or because she was experiencing the sound vibrations coming up through the operating table itself. He says this would allow Pam to hear conversations in the room. As for the bone saw, Worley thinks Pam imagined it based on other similar-looking dental drills she was already familiar with. Worley believes that Pam experienced anesthesia awareness. This is where a person remains conscious but is unable to move. It's estimated this occurs in about 1 out of every 2,000 procedures. Only none of these explanations have fully convinced Dr. Sabom or Dr. Spetzler. They both believe the combination of anesthesia and reduced brain activity from lowering Pam's body temperature would have made it impossible for her to form or retain any sort of memories throughout her operation. Although Sabom does admit this leaves open the possibility that perhaps consciousness can still continue even while the brain is essentially offline. But what does that mean exactly? Is this just another way of saying that the soul lives on even after the body dies? This is the question that has plagued scientists and theologians for as long as recorded history. The idea of the afterlife is nothing new. Archaeologists have found ancient Cro-Magnon burial sites that contain both weapons and food, indicating that ancient peoples believed they needed to prepare their dead for another existence. The ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife called Aru, the field of reeds. This was a perfect afterlife, an abundant version of Egypt where virtuous souls live eternally in peace, enjoying endless harvests and life's simple pleasures without suffering. But before they would let you in, you'd have to get in line and wait to have your heart placed on a scale. Then the gods would weigh your heart against an ostrich feather. If you balance the scales, then you'd be allowed to make the journey to Aru. But hearts that were too heavy with evil would tumble into the crocodile jaws of the goddess Ami. Any souls that fell prey to this second death would then be doomed to restlessness in the duat. In ancient Greek literature, Plato wrote about a soldier named Aer who fell in battle. But just as they laid this soldier on a funeral pyre preparing to cremate him, his eyes popped back open and he came back to life. He told his startled family members about all the wondrous things he had witnessed in the realm beyond. The soldier claimed that after he died, his soul went to another realm where spirits were judged by divine beings who knew everything that he had done in life. After being shown a number of amazing sights, Aer was sent back to his physical body. Plato's story is considered a work of fiction, but it still contains many of the same sorts of details we hear time and again from real people who claim to have had near-death experiences. You can find a similar description of the afterlife in the 8th century Tibetan Book of the Dead. The ancient Tibetan holy men believed that dying was an art, and that you could be taught to do it well. One way they would do this would be to actually read the instruction manual to them during the last minutes of their life, or during their funeral. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, those approaching death would first find themselves suspended in a misty gray void. As the spirit comes to realize that it's actually dead, they begin to see and hear their deceased loved ones, who lead them to a realm of light. In 1589, Italy's Prince Fabrizio Massimo was grieving over the impending death of his 14-year-old son, who had fallen deathly ill from a fever. When it became clear that the boy would not survive, the family sent for a priest. The priest they sent for was Father Filippo Nero, who is considered to be a supernaturally gifted holy man. It was said that Father Filippo had levitated during Mass, had performed many successful exorcisms, and could even bring people back from the dead. Unfortunately, Father Filippo arrived 30 minutes too late, so Paolo Massimo was already dead. Father Filippo was moved by the father's anguish over his dead son, so the priest knelt before the boy's body and prayed, anointing the body with holy water. Then he leaned over and blew in the boy's face and called out his name. Then the boy opened his eyes and began to speak. He told everyone that he had just been in heaven and he had seen his mother and his deceased sister. It was the most wonderful place he had ever been, and he desperately wanted to go back. So with a wave of his hand, the priest told Paolo it was okay. He could go now. And once again, the boy died for good. You can find plenty of similar stories throughout the history of the Catholic Church. But until the 19th century, science refused to take such stories seriously about the afterlife. During the late 19th century, there lived a Swiss professor of geology named Albert Heim. He was also an avid mountain climber. And in 1871, he had his own near-death experience after he slipped and fell off a cliff while climbing the Swiss Alps. Heim later wrote about how his entire life flashed before his eyes as he plummeted to what he thought would be certain doom. Then came a brief moment where he was overcome by an immense sense of calm. He felt as if his spirit drifted up to what he could only describe as a magnificent heaven. After Heim recovered from his fall, he decided to seek out others who may have had similar experiences. In 1892, Heim published an article that analyzed more than 30 stories of people who had suffered near-fatal falls in the Alps. This article was the first official study that identified many of the common elements of near-death experiences. He described how time seemed to slow down for people, how people claimed they could see their entire life flashing before their eyes, and about having a moment of extreme peace and bliss right there at the end. Around the same time is when the spiritualist boom really began. Several other serious researchers in Europe and America began to study the existence of ghosts and otherworldly apparitions. Some of these scientists also became interested in deathbed visions. One such person was Sir William Barrett, a physician at the Royal College of Science in Dublin. During the 1920s, he began gathering deathbed visions after his wife, an obstetrician, told him an unusual story. On January 12, 1924, Lady Barrett delivered the baby of a woman named Doris, who died shortly after giving birth. But before Doris closed her eyes for the last time, she gave out a radiant smile and told everyone that she could see her father standing there to help her cross over. She even had a conversation with him. And based on what Lady Barrett heard her say, the woman's father assured her that her baby would be all right and that it was okay for her to go. What's particularly compelling about this story was that at one point Doris mentioned that her father had her sister Vida with her, but Doris's sister had died just a couple weeks earlier, and she had not been told of her sister's death before her own passing. Sir William Barrett published the story and many others like it in his book, Deathbed Confessions, published in 1926. He did admit that many people on the verge of death experience hallucinations. But he also pointed out how many of the people he interviewed remained perfectly lucid right up until the moment of their death. 30 years later, Barrett's book would inspire a psychologist named Carlos Osis to undertake his own studies of deathbed visions. Osis conducted his study in 1959 and 1960. He used modern statistical methods to demonstrate that deathbed visions had nothing to do with hallucinations, nor were they the result of drugs or fevers. During the 1970s, Osis joined the American Society for Psychical Research. After joining the ASPR, Osis worked with another psychologist named Erlander Haraldson to conduct an even broader study into deathbed visions. They interviewed hundreds of doctors and nurses in both the United States and India, hoping to compare the stories based on cultural differences. Of the more than 1,700 people they interviewed, about half of them reported stories of people claiming to see visions of apparitions right before death. Interestingly, about 29% reported these weren't always positive experiences either. Some people claimed they felt terrified of the entities that appeared before them as they died. But one thing that became clear during their study was that people from all walks of life had similar near-death experiences. These individual experiences were influenced by their religions and cultures, but there were still many elements in common. The dying Indian patients often reported seeing religious figures, while Americans tended to see deceased friends and family members. Yet they both reported stories of dark tunnels and bright lights at the end. One of the most famous people to ever write about death and dying was psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. During the 1950s, Kubler-Ross worked with terminally ill patients in Chicago. This led to her identifying the 5 stages of grief you're likely familiar with: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. In 1969, Kubler-Ross published her best-selling book on death and dying that brought the ways we deal with death into the public's consciousness. But while Kubler-Ross was receiving praise for her books on grief and dying, her studies began to turn towards the metaphysical. During the late 1960s, Kubler-Ross heard an unusual story from a dying woman she referred to only as Mrs. Schwartz. As the woman lay dying from internal bleeding, she told Kubler-Ross that she found herself floating above her own body. She said she was able to see everything in the room, including the doctors and nurses as they attempted to resuscitate her. She said she re-entered her body as she was being wheeled to the morgue, and she managed to pull the sheet off her head. But this revival didn't last, and soon the woman died. All this working with the dead and grieving took a toll on Kubler-Ross, and over time she made a decision to step away from her specialty. But immediately after she made this decision, she said that Mrs. Schwartz appeared before her, looking just as solid and real as she was. Kubler-Ross even said that she got the woman to follow her to her office and sign her name on a piece of paper to prove that she was there. Kubler-Ross even claimed to have had her own out-of-body experience one night when she returned to her hotel room after an exhausting all-night workshop in the mid-1970s. She said that as she lay there in her bed, she began floating over her own body, and she saw a group of spirits attending to her physical form. When she woke back up later inside her own body, she said she felt better than she had in years. But as Kubler-Ross began speaking more openly about spiritual matters during the 1970s, her reputation suffered. But her work set the stage for what is considered to be the most influential book about near-death experiences ever written, Life After Life, by Raymond Moody. He's actually the person credited with coining the term near-death experience. Moody first became interested in the subject of NDEs in the 1960s while he was a philosophy student at the University of Virginia. He became obsessed with the story told by his professor, Dr. George Ritchie, a psychiatry teacher at the school. Back in 1943, Ritchie was a young soldier in Texas who fell ill with pneumonia. But the Army doctors neglected to treat him, and soon they discovered his body was immobile with no signs of a heartbeat. So they covered him with a sheet and sent him to the morgue. It was only after one of the morgue attendants noticed the sheet covering Ritchie had begun to move did they realize that he was still alive. They gave him a shot of adrenaline, which got him moving again. Days later, he woke in the hospital with the story that he had been up and walking around, observing everything going on while he was believed to be dead. There was something else about Richie's near-death experience that is common among experiencers. He described himself being profoundly changed by this experience. After Richie recovered from his illness, he felt he had gotten so close to something divine that he decided to dedicate his life to serving God and humanity. In 1972, after Raymond Moody received his doctorate in philosophy, he encountered a student who had a remarkably similar NDE story to Richie's. From there, Moody began to reach out to other doctors, collecting more than 150 NDE stories. Some such stories came from people who were declared dead, then resuscitated. Others were people who suffered accidents or severe illnesses who came close to death. Moody cataloged all the common elements people described. This included the feeling of serenity, the sensation of being pulled out of the body and floating above it, the dark tunnel with the light at the end, and meeting others in that light. Sometimes these were deceased loved ones. Other times they were other spiritual entities that Christians came to think of as angels or even God himself. By some accounts, more than 9 million people in the United States alone claim to have had a near-death experience. One other common feature of these NDEs is that all these people come away profoundly changed. Many people dedicate themselves to the church or are doing whatever they can to drastically improve their lives. In some cases, this isn't always a good thing either. Some marriages are broken up because suddenly their spouses no longer recognize the person they married. Some people Raymond Moody interviewed said they actually went through that brilliant light at the end of the tunnel. They described seeing things like beautiful fields or white clouds. In most of these accounts, they were asked questions by the beings they were with. Questions like, "Are you ready to die now?" Or, "Are you happy with how you lived your life?" Moody never really says just how many people answered no to these questions, but since the ones he interviewed were all back among the living, you have to assume it's most, if not all of them. Moody published his findings in 1975, claiming that NDEs were real. Almost immediately, he faced backlash from people who said his methodology wasn't scientific. For one thing, he didn't take a random sampling of people. He specifically sought out the most interesting-sounding stories that fit best into his narrative. He was accused of being biased in his belief that an afterlife was real and that he was just looking for any anecdotes that supported his beliefs. Moody vehemently denied these accusations, though, and insisted his methods were solid and scientific. But there's another side to this story. You see, not all NDEs are positive experiences. It's estimated that about 20% of the people who have one recall going somewhere else, somewhere Christians might describe as hell. One such story comes to us from a man named Howard Storm. In 1985, he was a 38-year-old art professor, as well as an avowed atheist. In the summer of that year, he was touring Europe with his wife and a group of students. Things had been going well until they got to their last stop in Paris. That's when Storm began suffering terrible stomach pains from a perforated intestine. He was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, but after he got to the hospital, Howard died. But unlike a lot of the other stories we've discussed here, Howard's played out more like something from a horror movie. He said he remembered seeing his wife standing by his window, but instead of her crying, she was angry. He tried speaking her name, but she ignored him. He tried to open the curtains, but he couldn't. That's when he began to hear voices calling his name in perfect English. Howard went out into the hallway outside his hospital room. There he saw a group of dark, cloaked figures waiting for him. These figures reached out and grabbed him. They dragged him down the hallway where it grew darker until it was almost pitch black. There were monstrous creatures all around him. Something about these creatures made him think they used to be human beings. They started ripping him to pieces. Howard screamed out for someone to save him. He shouted every prayer he knew, which caused the monsters to retreat. Then he was carried up into heaven. Howard thought it was the most amazing place he'd ever been. He wanted to stay there forever, but a voice told him no, it wasn't his time yet. After that, Howard's soul was sent hurtling back into his body. When he recovered from his illness, Howard abruptly quit his teaching job and enrolled in a divinity school, where he became an ordained minister. Since then, Howard has published books and given lectures about his experiences, spreading the message he was told that we should all worship God. One of the leading experts into studying NDEs is Dr. Bruce Grayson, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia. Grayson's first experiences with NDEs occurred more than 50 years ago when he was just a few months out of medical school. He was on call at an ER, at the time eating lunch in the cafeteria when his pager went off. There was a young woman who had been brought into the ER after attempting to take her own life. Grayson was eating spaghetti at the time, and when the pager went off, it startled him, causing him to drip spaghetti sauce in his tie. He tried to wipe off the tomato sauce, but it left a red stain he couldn't get rid of. So the only thing Grayson could do was button up his jacket to cover the stain. Then he rushed up to see the patient. It was a young woman who had overdosed on pills. When Grayson got to her, she was unconscious. Since she was unable to talk to him, he then left the room to question the woman's roommate. The following day, the patient was finally awake, so Grayson went to see her. He introduced himself. But then she told him things that changed his life forever. Because this young woman claimed to have already seen Grayson. In fact, she not only claimed to have seen him, but she said that she was right there when he was talking to the roommate. She was even able to recount details of the conversation the two of them had. She even mentioned that he had a red stain on his tie, which is impossible for her to have known. Since then, Dr. Grayson went on to study hundreds of near-death experience cases. And he admits that one of the main problems we have with proving NDEs are real is that practically all the evidence we have are anecdotal stories. But so many of these stories have proven so compelling, like that of Pam Reynolds, it's difficult to discount everything out of hand. Let's face it, human memories are fallible. One plausible explanation for all the stories of NDEs is that they are just products of the human imagination, built out of our personal and cultural experiences. But Bruce Grayson notes that the stories told by experiencers are different in that they remain consistent, even for decades. People who had an NDE are able to recount the details of their experience as if they had just occurred. Grayson doesn't think we should just discount just how profoundly changed these people were by their experiences. At the same time, there are some skeptics who think there's a more down-to-earth explanation to NDEs. Some scientists who have studied the phenomenon think human biology is at work. Scientists who have studied the brains of people during the moment of death realize that their systems release a massive combination of chemicals and endorphins, including serotonin. This is the chemical that makes you feel happy, which could certainly account for the sense of peace and calm that overcomes a lot of people during an NDE. In fact, some scientists have taken this a step further and determined that it's possible to trigger an experience that's very similar to an NDE by administering a mixture of psychedelic drugs, such as ayahuasca. One study was conducted in which a group of 13 subjects were given a form of ayahuasca called DMT. In all 13 instances, each of the respondents described an incredible sense of peace and calm, followed by them seeing a bright light. Skeptics also point to other experiences people have that resemble those described during NDEs. Fighter pilots and astronauts undergoing high-G tests have reported extreme tunnel vision and even seeing a bright light at the end. This is brought on by the brain being starved for oxygen. This is something called the dying brain hypothesis. People who climb mountains without oxygen have sometimes reported feeling as if there was someone there with them climbing alongside them. Likewise, people suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy have also experienced similar things to NDEs during a seizure. But science can't explain everything, though. In fact, sometimes it just opens up more questions. In 2023, a study was done of 4 patients who were in long-term vegetative states whose family members agreed to take them off life support. With the family members' consent, each of these individuals' brains were monitored in their last moments as they died. The really strange thing, though, is, although these were all people whose brain activity was completely flat, in their last moments, their brain scans suddenly showed signs of activity that had not been there before. Even stranger still, as much as 3 minutes after death, their brain activity practically lit up. Which of course raises the question, what did these people experience in those last few minutes? For people who have had near-death experiences, they don't need any proof. They just know there is something more that awaits us after death. People like Pam Reynolds were forever changed by their experience. They come back with a message that we are all more connected than we think we are, and that we need to love each other. Pam Reynolds died from heart failure in 2010 at age 53. We'll never know for sure if the story she and other people like her have told about what lies ahead after death are correct. At least not until the day comes when we die. And maybe we'll get to see for ourselves. So what do you think? Do you know anyone who's ever had a near-death experience? Leave a comment below and let me hear your story. And if you'd like to hear even more strange stories, then click the video on the screen right now. Thanks again!